being human better. I think that's really the opportunity with AGI, is how can we focus on being obviously better humans as individuals, but ultimately I think the biggest challenge is building new systems.
Hello and welcome to AGI Nexus recording, where we get to talk about all the beautiful, beneficial futures that can come about and should come about in a future of AGI. Today I'm joined by Dr. Cadell Last. He's an anthropologist and philosopher whose work delves into biocultural evolution, the mind-matter relationship, and speculative futures. He's the creator and founder of Philosophy Portal at philosophyportal.online. And welcome, Cadell. It's so good to have you here.
To be here. It's been a long journey of tarrying with the technological singularity, and I'm really excited to get into conversations about the beneficial aspects of it.
Critical. I think that this conference series, the BGI conference series and the BGI Nexus was born from the idea that we're rapidly approaching AGI, more advanced AI systems at a very minimum. And yet we're still at a point where they can be directed in beneficial directions or not, right? We have that opportunity. This is a critical moment where that juncture can happen. And of course, with this year's BGI conference, we'll be looking at how we can look at AGI that builds a compassionate and abundant future. I'd love to get your perspective on some of the most critical components that make this fork in the road right now. How can we steer towards BGI, towards beneficial AI systems for global good?
First, I want to emphasize that my interest in the technological singularity and artificial intelligence has always come from an anthropological perspective. I'm not trained in the technical fields of artificial intelligence, although I've studied it a bit. It's not my field of expertise. Always motivated me since discovering or being even convinced at the possibility of technological singularity, probably back in 2005, reading Ray Kurzweil's work and stuff like that, is basically thinking through what are the consequences for human beings. How is this going to change our world? And so that's kind of always been what's oriented, what's motivated me. And so in terms of steering, obviously a cybernetic metaphor that's often brought up in this context, I honestly think that it has to come to the level of thinking through human relationships and how do we do being human better. I think that's really the opportunity with AGI, is how can we focus on being obviously better humans as individuals, but ultimately I think the biggest challenge is building new systems. I'm sort of the mind that, and this is sort of the major concept that orients a lot of my earlier work on the singularity, is that we're going through a meta-system transition, which basically means I think the institutions and the systems of the 20th century, or broadly speaking, the industrial period, are undergoing a fundamental reorganization. And I've always thought about our generation's role is to actually, that our journeys, our careers, our processes are the very things that are going to build the next system. So I at least that's the kind of way I think into this issue.
I love that. We as humans, doesn't seem we were super self-conscious about the invention of other pivotal technologies, writing, walking upright, right? These happened and they were for utility and a specific purpose. Perhaps I might think back to democracy and its implementation. That was a very self-reflective process by a few, at least. But here we are at the cusp of AGI, and this is a technology that will have profound implications, profound changes across humanity and the world. And we have this opportunity to be reflective about, are we going to build it for utility, like writing? You know, we need to count how many cows and bushels of grain we have, or is this for something more? Is this supportive of becoming more human? And what type of humans do we want to become? What is our next step?
There are so many people I collaborate with who are starting to use this language of becoming more human, and I think it is sort of the language that appeals to me in terms of that there is actually an opportunity here to become more human, not just a empty rhetoric. That in many ways, what we're dealing with here, in my view, with artificial intelligence, and you were referencing previous changes in technology and how that's affected humanity, I think that we're looking at these. I think what we should be paying attention to are these waves of industrial production changing. So, like, we've gone through waves of industrial production changing in the past for the last 2 centuries. Arguably, we've been undergoing these transformations. I know that there's sort of rhetoric of a fourth industrial revolution that we're in the midst of, or that is currently unfolding. And I think that from the social perspective, from the anthropological perspective, from the human perspective, these waves of industrial production always disrupt work, fundamentally change how institutions work, and consequently it changes our social relationships and what's possible within our social relationships. And I think that a lot of the industrial institutionals setups that we've constructed in the 20th century are in many ways liberations from a certain form of previous life, agricultural life, but in many ways they also deaden us in unique ways. They can become monotonous, they can become very routine, they can become very, let's say, expressions of the dead letter, and in that sense, I think that the artificial intelligence revolution, if this is the dominant technology that's driving industrial change at the moment, it does offer us an opportunity to rethink professional identity and rethink professional organizations and why we write or why we speak or why we come together. I think the universities are going through this right now. I have many friends in universities who, of course, are saying, okay, we're using ChatGPT to grade papers and students are using ChatGPT to write papers. And so the whole process now is redundant or makes no sense. But there's an opportunity there. And that's actually one of the opportunities that I'm exploring at Philosophy Portal is why do we write papers? How do we write papers? Rethinking the very processes by which we create intellectuals and philosophers and artists and cultivating, becoming more human in general. So those are the types of things that really motivate me and inspire me, is in short, that there's a wave of industrial production that's coming through artificial intelligence, through artificial general intelligence on the timescales that people like Kurzweil and people like Ben Goertzel often speak about. And then the challenge for us is to take on board that information and rethink how we do adulthood. I think, and that's actually a really interesting challenge because, and we don't often think about it like that, but there's a philosopher I like, Alenka Zupancic, who kind of inverts this idea of where do babies come from? She asks, where do adults come from? And I think that this idea, where do adults come from, is a really nice speculative notion to actually think about, okay, what we mean by adult, what we mean by even a professional identity or middle age, is something that goes through transformations historically in time. And if we're entering a new age of production, if we're entering a new age of technological revolution, that means that we're entering into a new creative space for reinventing our social possibilities. And what are those social possibilities? What do they look like? So that's another connection. The idea of—
Yeah, absolutely. There's this idea that we go to school, we learn a bunch of things, we go to work, we earn an economy. That's our identity. That's our value. Sitting in a cubicle, doing paperwork or cold calling contacts or forming partnerships, what have you. Now, when we see the age of AI that's able to do so many of these tasks, it's really forcing a question of who are we? Who am I? If I am not my work, if my work may disappear or not be valuable for economy anymore, who am I? I think it's so interesting in the terms of weaving has always been a technology that's driven technology itself, right? We needed to make lots of cloth for sales, and it was one of the precursors to coding even. But just because of the massive industrialization and capability of machines and technology to weave does not mean that we no longer have knitters and weavers. People now take this up as the hobby, right? It doesn't stop us from doing these creative pursuits that define, more of our humanity in creativity. It's just that we're not getting paid for it anymore. It's not that we'll stop making music because we have great AI music generators. The act of making music is very human and is an expression of who we are and what we are and what we aspire to be. I'd love to talk about this in terms of your focus on biocultural evolution and what that means with AGI and the future of humanity.
Yeah, it's a big can of worms. They want to go down that road with biocultural evolution. I really love to go down that road. I just want to emphasize first that this question, who am I, that you're centering, that this is an eternal philosophical question. Plato's asking himself this idea, Hegel's asking himself this idea, and I think we should all ask ourselves these ideas throughout our career. And I also like that you're emphasizing this in the context of where do most of us get our social value, where do most of us stabilize our identity, and it is in a lot of things within an economic framework that is it's a certain narrow constraint. And I think that we should emphasize this narrow constraint is potentially going to become either a lot different or a lot wider or other to what it is right now. And that's precisely where we should ask ourselves, who am I? What am I in social context, in the context of value? And I just want to also emphasize that in these conversations of artificial general intelligence, oftentimes we can, I think, and this has been a large part of my work, is I think a lot of times we can imagine ourselves or we can avoid the deep philosophical work by imagining that humans won't be there when artificial general intelligence is. It's almost like AGI is present and humans are no longer present, like they take over from us. And I think that this is actually at the core of avoiding, I think it's a kind of psychological avoidance of what we need to ask that question of who am I and what are we as a species. It's an opportunity. I know that there are people in the technological singularity community who have started to think in this direction. I think Kevin Kelly is someone who I think has often provoked thinking in this direction, for example. So I just want to emphasize that. And it could actually be, and this is a sort of an idea I'm kind of currently working on, which is that AGI and imagining humans not present when AGI is present could be actually a meta critique on hyper-specialization, like that we're all so hyper-specialized in our careers that if AGI were to exist, we couldn't imagine ourselves existing because we've lost a general intelligence and we've become too hyper specialist. So I think that the challenge here with AGI is, can we do HGI? Can we do a human general intelligence? And can we become more human general intelligence again, as opposed to just becoming hyper specialized? And so that's a challenge that's before us. And I think that challenge comes in what you emphasized already with these unpaid creative pursuits. I think that every human being has an abstract speculative capacity, which is undervalued. What I mean by abstract speculative capacity is, things that kindergarten children do. Like I remember as a kid just drawing endless amounts of pictures or writing in my diary and coming up with games. Like me and my brother would constantly come up with new games on the weekend, and actually
just going outside and running. Yeah. We watch so much Netflix or whatever, chat with LMs all day, and we don't spontaneously use this beautiful gift of body that children can't help using. Body. They can't sit still.
Absolutely. So all of that and now all of that on the table, and from the perspective of we don't take that as seriously as we should because we struggle to connect that to economic valuation, and in that context social valuation connected to the economic valuation. And so if we can rethink that, I think that's a good ground to play and to anyway, and then that's a challenge before us. But you emphasized and you wanted to bring up the biocultural evolution dimension, and that's something that I think we should go into as well, which is an idea I've had is that our culture has never been good at what I call both reproducing biologically and culturally. I'm going to try and develop that out. We've never done both well. We always sacrifice, we always have a trade-off of one for the other. So like in traditional societies, they would emphasize, usually through a religious culture, they would emphasize biological reproduction. So we would have 6, 7 children, we'd have big families, have big family networks. And a consequence of that is that I think our cultural reproduction would suffer in the sense that men and women as individuals would not be able to dedicate as much time and energy towards cultural reproduction as modern human subjects do. Now, in our current culture, there is a sort of individualism which does sort of emphasize your cultural reproduction to become whatever it is you want to become as an individual in culture. And biological reproduction and familial reproduction can suffer as a result of that. So there's a trade-off that we've undergone where we've never been able to do biocultural evolution together very well. We usually sacrifice one for the other. And I think that in revisioning this new society, in revisioning what's possible socially in let's say, a transformed social economy, I think that would be where I would pose the challenge for biocultural evolution is, can we think both? And how do we think both? And that's a unique contradiction and a unique challenge for the human being, because it is our unique challenge. And whether AGI becomes autonomous and whether technological life becomes its own thing, and on the other hand, the biological life that we come from, biological life doesn't deal with the contradiction of biocultural evolution, and I don't think AGI will deal with the contradiction of biocultural evolution either, but humans do. And it brings us to the most intimate questions. The most intimate questions are, I think, at level. Like, so for example, me and my partner thinking about how do we both, we're both educated, we both live in an urban environment. How do we both build our careers and build family at the same time in a way that we both feel is liberating and life-giving and playful and so forth?
So interesting to talk about in the context of children liberating, right? It's so interesting to think about in this conversation of becoming human, being more human, using technologies or building technologies which help us be more unleashed in our humanity instead of constrained. And we have so many people who are acting like computers, which is in part why they can be replaced, right? We have LLMs now that can create a tweet. Do we need as many people building tweets, or is that more an automaton, not an expression? There's so much creativity in writing this content. But is it the highest form of expression of humanity and creativity and building? And then the context of having children, there's something so human there biologically, but there's just from experience, one thing that I discovered and was always fascinated by is there's a whole dimension of humanity that unlocks with children when you have children or individuals that are like children, foster children or such, where when this unselfishness, my progeny means more to me than my life, right? There's a whole dimension of humanity that can unlock there. And it, in our current cultural situation, more focused perhaps on cultural evolution, it looks like that will tie me down if I feel that way, rather than looking like that there's both pieces there. Human.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. I think we do. And I myself, you could even define my adult life as this internal struggle with this motivation culturally to make an impact and to develop myself and to become all I can be. And I have oftentimes thought having a child would take away from that or get in the way of that or somehow, potentially thwart my capacities in some deep sense. So, we do think about it in that way. And I think that probably we do think about it that way because there is a rationale to that, because of the social and economic value aspects that we're thinking about, because we think that my social and economic value will take a hit. How do I overcome that? But I think another interesting aspect of what you're saying is this the role of a child, having a child, or somehow participating in the fullness of humanity in that way, as decentering myself, like that the other becomes more important than myself. I think, of course, we can experience that in an intimate partner relationship, but probably to a deeper level with having an actual child. So yeah, that decentering aspect I think is also key.
Focus. Also, it makes me curious if part of our cultural hesitation towards AGI is this selfishness. It's like having a child, creating artificial human level intelligence. And is there something that seems sort of constraining to being, to enacting what I want to build and be in the world?
Often consider it. We don't I think that's a great question that you're just asking. And I think that we don't often consider it, but that it's a kind of egoic humiliation. Like we could feel humiliated, if I've trained my entire life to do X, Y, or Z in a certain technical field, and then an AGI can come along and do it instantaneously or at a much better rate, or something that there's a certain humiliation to that, and there's a certain potential emotional crisis that could open up there, because it does ask that question of who am I again, and am I going to have to completely reinvent myself? What you're saying.
See hope or a direction that helps humanity build AI, AGI, advanced AI in ways that support humanity to this new adulthood, to maturating in a different way, instead of just being the adversarial component that brings up the fears, something that actually helps address humanity to being its best self.
A really good question. I think that, another philosopher I like, Slavoj Žižek, has often joked that in communism, or this is again as a joke, but that the challenge we would face in communism is human envy, human jealousy, human rivalry, that all of these negative emotional affects that we can use either hierarchies or institutions to numb or to soften would explode in a different social organization. And oftentimes I think, politically, we should not underestimate, we are at the moment politically, I think, going through a sort of return or a revival to certain forms of hierarchical authoritarianism and strong men and big men and I'm the powerful guy type of mentality. And I think that people can find this attractive because actually we are scared to exist in a social organization that's more egalitarian or more horizontal, precisely because we would have to confront negative emotions like the envy, like the jealousy, like the conflict, like I think you were pointing towards adversarial violence, violent conflict, right, that can emerge. So I think that ultimately in rethinking the human, we should be playful and think about the playful creative possibilities and the abstract speculative possibilities that are within us. We should also think about the darker aspects of our nature, the more violent aspects of our nature, the more adversarial and opponent oriented aspects of our nature, that those things are the biggest challenge, actually, I think, to a different type of social organization, because it requires that I change the way I relate to them. Take, for example, we could say abstract creativity is beautiful, fantastic, and if someone else creates something that's objectively better or more socially valued than what I can create, I can feel jealous. I can feel negative emotion. Creativity can also bring out those negative emotions as well. And so that's something that, yeah, it's a huge challenge. But I like that you're emphasizing it in this framework of a different type of maturation, a new adulthood. I always liked the science fiction book Childhood's End, that Arthur C. Clarke in Childhood's End, actually, what I think in that book is that it represents that we struggle so much to imagine the beyond of the childhood of humanity. Like that still infantile relative to what we might be. And it's so difficult to imagine what a matured humanity would actually be and how it would actually express itself.
So interesting to me to look at our own imaginations of sci-fi futures. There are the speculative that are way out on the edge and really imagining something that is almost unimaginable and still trying to communicate it. And then you have sci-fi, like I would point at Star Wars, which is basically the American 70s in space. You know, like it was not that speculative, right? You have all the same relationships and troubles and workforce and wars and